Okay, so this is completely unrelated to the movie I'm about to review. I just thought I'd bring it up because it's been on my mind for a while, and also I'm going to talk about Star Wars a lot during this video, so perfect opportunity, really. So something that I've noticed is that there seems to be a lot of confusion over Darth Vader's name. I feel like this misconception was kind of popularized by the movie Pitch Perfect, but it seems like a lot of people believe that Darth Vader's name being Darth Vader is supposed to be foreshadowing to the reveal that he is in fact Luke Skywalker's father, because the word Vader is vaguely similar to the German word Vater, which translates to father. But that notion of Vader's name being foreshadowing is completely untrue. That's just a funny coincidence. You see, the reason Darth Vader's name is Darth Vader, and the reasoning is so blatantly obvious that I felt stupid I didn't realize it. An acquaintance of mine actually had to explain it to me when I was like 19. But the reason Darth Vader's name is Darth Vader is because he's a dark invader. He's an alien invader. Like, the first time we meet Darth Vader in the original Star Wars movie, what's he doing? He's invading a rebel ship, the Tantive 4. In Revenge of the Sith, when Darth Sidious gives the name Darth Vader to Anakin Skywalker, the first thing he does is invade the Jedi Temple during Order 66. This is an incredibly common naming convention for Sith characters in the Star Wars universe. Emperor Palpatine is called Darth Sidious because he's dark and insidious. He's pure evil. Count Dooku is called Darth Tyrannus because he's dark and tyrannical. He's literally a political leader. He's actually a count, which is a royal title. And we find out in the Bad Batch that he actually oppressed his people of the planet Sereno. And Darth Maul is called Darth Maul because he's a vicious adversary. To maul someone is to viciously attack them. There's also kind of a double meaning with Maul's name, because a maul could also be a warhammer. You know, a weapon of war. Maul is a living weapon. He's a blunt instrument that's just used to kill. That's why he exists. So yeah, the reason why Darth Vader's name is Darth Vader is because he's a dark invader. Like, literally, that's literally the only reason why. It's a very simple reason, and, you know, maybe it's just me, but it feels like a lot of people just don't get that. Anyway, on to the review. Hey everyone, I'm Ben, your underground conductor, and welcome to Underground Cinema. This week should be fun, because for this video, I'll be celebrating the 20th anniversary of Revenge of the Sith. So I figured what better way to celebrate the anniversary of what is my favorite film of all time than to talk about the movie Jumper from 2008, starring Hayden Christensen. So before I jump into the movie, pun intended, I should preface this by saying I am a massive Star Wars fan. I've loved Star Wars since I was a kid. I own literally almost every single Star Wars movie on DVD, with the exception of the 3 I don't think are particularly good. Don't at me. I even own the holiday special and the 2 Ewok movies. And additionally, I also own the entirety of the Clone Wars animated series. Both the 3D version from Dave Filoni and George Lucas, and the 2D version from Genndy Tartakovsky. And the reason why I own these shows, and really nothing else, is because I am a massive fan of the prequel era specifically. I grew up during the prequel era. I remember when I was a kid, me and my friends would constantly quote Star Wars to each other, and when we would respond to questions, we'd say, Roger, 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 Roger. And just like every other prequel fanboy, I am a very avid defender of Revenge of the Sith. As mentioned, Revenge of the Sith is literally my favorite film of all time. It's in the #1 position in my Letterboxd top 4, and when I rewatched the film earlier this year for the early 20th anniversary screenings that they had in theaters, just sitting there and watching it in the way it was meant to be seen just filled me with such a sense of awe and appreciation, and really just added to my overall love of this admittedly flawed film. Now, I won't get into precise detail about why I love Revenge of the Sith so much, If you want to know my opinion, you could watch the podcast episode I did with Brendan from Cloud City Conversations a few years ago. I explain it in detail there. I'll leave a link in the description. And also, funny thing, I'm wearing the podcast t-shirt right now. But what I will say is that a big reason why I love the prequels and Revenge of the Sith so much is because of the character story for Anakin Skywalker, and how the painful journey of this character eventually leads to his downfall and descent into the dark side. And putting aside George Lucas's character writing, which is criminally underrated, I might add, a big reason of why Anakin's character turn works, at least for me, is because of Hayden Christensen's performance. Despite what literally anyone says, Hayden Christensen in those movies did exactly what he was supposed to do for that character, and he did perfectly. Now, moving on from that point, you might be asking why I just spent the last few minutes simping so hard for the prequels. Well, putting aside the fact that I'm a Gen Z kid who is legally obligated to love those movies, there's actually two reasons why I'm bringing up the prequels so much. Reason number one, because as mentioned, Hayden Christensen stars in Jumper, and Jumper is one of two movies that people bring up when they talk about his talent as an actor. The other film obviously being Shattered Glass. But the other reason why I'm bringing up the prequels so much is because of how much the movie Jumper oddly relates to both the prequel trilogy, but more specifically Revenge of the Sith. And what do I mean by that? Well, when the movie Jumper begins, we meet the younger version of Hayden Christensen's character. We see that his character has become enamored by a brunette teenage white girl, and to show his affection for her, he gives her a gift. However, around this same time, he also discovers that he has magical abilities. And he chooses to leave his home and utilize these abilities to live the fabulous life that he's always wanted, traveling around the known world. After nearly a decade, Hayden Christensen ends up reuniting with this brunette white woman that he was in love with when he was younger. And after reuniting with her, he also discovers that she kept the gift that he gave her so many years ago. However, despite these developments, things are not nearly as pleasant as they could be, as Hayden Christensen's character is being actively hunted by a religious cult that uses weird sci-fi sticks, being led by Samuel L. Jackson, who has a scar across his face. Oh gee, I wonder how he got that. Anyway, Samuel L. Jackson is hunting Hayden Christensen specifically because he is of the opinion that Hayden Christensen has too much power and that he's too dangerous to be left alive. Hayden Christensen then discovers that the woman that he loves has now had her life put in terrible jeopardy, so he chooses to team up with a morally bankrupt individual with similar powers to him as a way to save her. We then have this climactic battle of massive scope between two former allies, and following this fight, Hayden Christensen is now forced to face his own potential death. However, he eventually overcomes his fate, and using all of his powers and raw emotion, he ends up destroying everything around him in an effort to save the woman that he loves. And with so much raw power, you could almost assume that he was the chosen one or something. In any case, Hayden Christensen eventually manages to defeat Samuel L. Jackson, and at the end of the film, he lives happily ever after with the woman that he loves. Man, that is such an uplifting ending. It's so nice to see Hayden Christensen actually, have something good happen to him. Anyway, if my assessment didn't make it abundantly clear, yeah, Jumper is remarkably similar to Revenge of the Sith. And what's even weirder is that no one ever talks about the similarities between these movies. I mean, I'll admit that in my plot synopsis, not every detail I brought up was in sequence with the actual film, but enough of them are similar to Revenge of the Sith that it just makes you say, what the f***? I mean, the fact that Hayden Christensen stars in this movie with Samuel L. Jackson should raise eyebrows within itself, because I'm pretty sure that this is the only film that the two of them appear in together outside the prequel trilogy. I could be wrong about that. In fact, after the recording, I'll probably do research to see if they've ever been in a different project together, aside from Star Wars, obviously. But, yeah, it's really strange. And in a lot of ways, it makes it feel like Jumper is like an alternate version of Revenge of the Sith. A version where, Hayden Christensen actually gets to end up with the love of his life, where Anakin actually does end up with Padme and leave it all behind. Not only that, but Jumper also kind of feels like a spiritual sequel to Revenge of the Sith. In the sense that the movie is all about Samuel L. Jackson hunting Hayden Christensen, it almost makes the movie seem like it's a Mace Windu revenge story. You know, the idea that Samuel L. Jackson is just hunting this guy who has spent his entire life running away from responsibility. And that just seems like a personal affront to him. It's interesting. But yeah, bottom line, Jumper is very similar to Revenge of the Sith. The movie is even complete with both the mommy issues and the daddy issues. It's great. But putting those similarities aside, how does Jumper stand by itself as a film? Well, it's okay. Okay. So, I want to make this clear. I really like this movie. And there's a lot of elements of this film that I think are done exceptionally well. So many attributes that I genuinely fall in love with each time I watch it. And I think I've only seen the film about 3 times, including my rewatch for this review. But if you're asking me to be objective about it, this movie's a little above average. Like, overall, if you're looking at the overall product. And there's reasons for that I want to get into in a bit. But before I, jump into the negatives, I should talk about what I think is genuinely good about this film. For one thing, I think the world building in this film is absolutely fantastic. I should mention, because I was vague about the magic powers in my plot synopsis, that this movie is about teleportation. And I think that the way they employ the teleportation mechanic in this movie and integrate it into the world that this film exists in is simply superb. I actually listened to the commentary track on this film, and the creators acknowledged that when they were crafting the teleportation effect, they asked themselves, okay, what is the byproduct of all of this, untethered movement from space to space? Because obviously there'd have to be a consequence to that kind of ability. And there's so many little things that you see in regards to how teleportation affects the world around these characters. Like the fact that the more inexperienced or emotional a Jumper feels, the more they affect the environment around them. Like, at the beginning of the film, when Hayden Christensen's character is sort of discovering his abilities, he causes actual physical damage to the spaces that he's in. You see cracks in the walls, damage to the floor, gusts of wind that blow everything everywhere. And it's because his character is basically folding space. There's a visible effect on reality, and that effect actually has a wider consequence on reality itself. Because as you see in this film, when a Jumper jumps from place to place, they leave behind a little gap in reality. They call it a jump scar. And it's sort of like residue left behind from basically a wormhole. And there is a little moment in the film that I did not notice on my rewatch. It was pointed out by Doug Liman, who directed this film, that when David teleports to his father's house after nearly 10 years, that you see briefly on the father's TV, it goes from whatever show he was watching to a New York broadcast station. And that's significant because David jumped from New York to Ann Arbor, where he grew up. So David basically carried the broadcast waves with him when he teleported home. That's just fundamentally interesting. And also, I'd like to bring up as a side note, completely unrelated, that Michael Rooker plays David's father in this film, and obviously he's a great actor, he does a great job in the limited role that he has, but this makes it the second movie in a row I've reviewed where Michael Rooker plays a shitty dad. Coincidence? Actually, yeah. Complete coincidence. You see, I had planned initially to do a separate review between Mallrats and Jumper, and I was going to make it vaguely Star Wars related and put it up on May the 4th, but, poor time management on my part, as well as, other life obligations got in the way, so I didn't end up doing that. So, as a result, I ended up reviewing these movies back-to-back, and I didn't realize it until I started planning both reviews that, Michael Rooker's a shitty dad in both movies. That's pretty funny. But yeah, anyway, the teleportation itself is a great effect, and the way they integrate it into the world is fantastic. They also explain it in really subtle ways throughout this film, like the fact that David can only teleport to a place that he's been to before, a place that he can see, or a place that he has a picture of. And they do not verbally explain these details at all in the movie. You just have to observe them visually, and I feel like that's great. There is instances of clunky exposition in this movie that explain certain aspects of it. Like, there's a conversation between David and the character of Griffin, who's another jumper, earlier in the movie, where they're, driving throughout Tokyo. And that scene between the two of them is very overtly an exposition dump that sort of helps you contextualize, like, different rules for how this works, like the fact that jumpers get their powers at around the age of 5, the fact that jumpers can pretty much teleport anything that they touch or anything that's in their immediate space. And that's a little clunky, and even the creators acknowledge that in the film commentary. It's a kind of a clunky exposition scene. And, the film also features narration at the very beginning. I think the narration is performed well. Hayden Christensen does the narration, and I think he is putting proper emotion into the voiceover performance. But the narration itself is very poorly integrated into the film, I feel at least. And Doug Liman initially didn't even want to do it. He was sort of talked into it, I think, by Simon Kinberg, who's one of the writers on this film. And I feel like Doug Liman and me, share a similar perspective about that, because he went to film school just like how I went to film school. And in film school, you are overtly told when you're learning how to write that narration is a very tricky thing to do. And oftentimes, it really just comes off as clunky exposition. So you're sort of steered away from doing that when you're learning the fundamentals of writing. Now, to be fair, there are instances of good narration in multiple films. Something that just comes off the top of my head would be The Fellowship of the Ring, Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring. The first few minutes of that have, great narration and plot setup, but it's seldom ever done that well in anything else. And Jumper is not an exception, unfortunately. Like I said, I think Hayden Christensen does a good job with the narration, but the narration itself feels clunky. Putting exposition aside, though, I do like the way other elements of this world sort of click together scene to scene. Like when we're introduced to the religious cult in this movie, the Paladins. It's established that they exist as an ever-present force of antagonism for jumpers, because jumpers have this unnatural ability, and Paladins see it as their responsibility to hunt these people down and, kill them. For the good of the world. And, it's also established in this film that Paladins have been around for centuries, that they're behind things like the, witch hunts and inquisitions that happen in multiple countries. And it's also implied that they sort of exist above normal governments. And I think all that information about Paladins is integrated very well into this version of the story. And I should mention that Jumper is in fact based on a book. It's based on a young adult novel by Stephen Good, I believe. And to my knowledge, I've never read the book. But apparently, Paladins don't appear in the book. They were made up for this film. And taking that into consideration, I think that they're integrated in pretty well. I really only have a couple nitpicks regarding the world building and how that reflects onto characters. I had a couple lingering questions throughout the film. The first question I had immediately is, how is David and Griffin, how are those characters not obese? We see near the beginning of the movie when David is in his apartment, he's too lazy to shift across his couch to grab his remote, so he teleports to grab his remote. Yet the guy is as buff as he was in Revenge of the Sith. So I'm just sitting there thinking to myself, how are you not obese? I mean, maybe he goes to the gym in his off time. Maybe it's one of those boring parts that they cut out of the movie. But it just made me wonder, how are you not fat? How's Griffin not fat? I mean, I guess Griffin makes sort of an effort to walk to places to make himself feel somewhat normal, but still. That's, one question I had. Another question I had, and this kind of really bothered me. Because this movie takes place mostly in a real world, with the, one fantastical element being that people can teleport. But I just had this question on my mind the whole movie. Why does no one have guns? Why does no one have guns? The Paladins have, these weird sci-fi electric sticks, similar to, the Magna Guard, shock rods that, General Grievous's bodyguards have. And they use those to, sort of disorientate jumpers and keep them from jumping from place to place because they can't focus. That makes sense as a world-building mechanic, but, why don't they also have guns? When Samuel Jackson kills jumpers, we see him do it in the movie. He stabs them with a knife. It's very ritualistic. And I get it, they're a religious cult, but, get a gun. Have a gun. And also, David and Griffin also don't have guns. Griffin uses a flamethrower in the movie, which is cool, but why don't you have a gun? The only time that a gun is even alluded to in this movie is when they're in Rome, and David is getting arrested for sneaking into the Colosseum. And also, because there was like a dead body in the Coliseum too that some lady saw. It doesn't matter. But I'm just thinking about, why are there no guns? Why are there no guns in this movie? Why are there no guns in this movie? I don't get it. I know I made a big deal of it, but it really is a smaller element of the movie. I didn't think it was that big of a deal. It didn't ruin the movie for me. Another thing I like about Jumper is how specific plot details unfold as the film keeps going, and how that eventually culminates toward the end of the film. A really good example of this sort of setup would be like how the character Griffin is set up in the backgrounds of different shots and scenes throughout Act 1, only to be properly introduced as a foil to David in Act 2. However, probably the most notable example of this is David's mother. As mentioned, Hayden Christensen's character in this film has both mommy issues and daddy issues. His character's mother left when he was about 5 years old, and we hear this at different points in the film. He explains this to the character of Griffin while the two of them are driving in Tokyo, and we also hear this from David's father when Roland, Samuel Jackson's character, goes to visit him. And there's a subtle expression that Samuel Jackson's character gives when he sees a photo of David's mother. It's almost as if he recognizes the woman. And then when David gets arrested in Rome, his mother appears randomly for literally 30 seconds, just 30 seconds, to get him out of that situation. It's the first time David has seen his mother in, like, 18 years. And she just goes in, goes out. It's a very quick interaction. It disturbs David, obviously. And he's just confused about the whole thing. But that scene really communicates, oh, this woman, she has something going on, and she's a very powerful person, evidently. It's just a very well-integrated detail, and it's very subtle. So subtle that one of the details that hints at it is the fact that in Griffin's lair, he has drawings and pictures of so many paladins that he's trying to hunt and kill, and one of the illustrations that he has is of David's mother. And that leads to the discovery that we have at the end of the film, where David finally tracks down his mother, and he, confronts her, and she admits that she's a paladin, that she hunts jumpers, and that the reason she left her son is because he got his powers at age 5, and she knew that she would either have to kill him or leave him to keep him safe. It's a very interesting element of the story that's set throughout the film that would have been really interesting to explore in future stories, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. But moving forward, I also want to talk about the performances in this movie, which I think are all fantastic. Samuel Jackson is one of the most prolific actors alive today. He's been in over 150 movies in his career, and he never misses a beat in any role he gets. You can make an argument saying that sometimes he's really just playing a caricature of himself, but he brings a gravitas to most of the films that he's in, and this film is no exception. And it's interesting when you look at his character as the leader of this religious cult, because the film frames him and the Paladins as antagonists, because they, go up against our main character, David. But they're kinda in the right. I mean, it's established in this film, and we see it, that Paladins will kill anyone in their way in order to get at a jumper. And that's bad. That's not good. But jumpers are people who have this, untethered ability to literally go anywhere and do anything they want. And we see examples of this in the film. The first thing David does, practically, after he figures out how to use his powers, is start robbing banks. And he builds an entire life around these actions to basically just do whatever he wants. So, in that sense, Roland's character is kinda in the right, and so are the Paladins. And this gets into another detail I wanted to bring up. The fact that David's character in this movie is so unapologetically selfish, and I love that. It's just so fun to watch, because this character is just so shamelessly self-concerned. There's a scene early on when he's in his little New York apartment, and he's watching TV, and on TV you see that, there's a storm that's completely destroyed this community, and a lot of people are stranded. It's sort of like a Hurricane Katrina style thing. And when he watches that on the TV, you kind of just assume, okay, he has these powers, there's people in danger, is he going to go help them? No. No. What he does is that he teleports to where the storm is heading, that way he could catch the waves that would come up from the storm, so he can surf on them. It's hilarious. And it really just illustrates how unconcerned he is about literally anything else in the world. All he does every single day of his life is live the best, most hedonistic life he could. And that's really what any character in this situation would do. It's very realistic. And once again, that reflects back onto the world building of this story. The film asks itself, and the creators once again confirm this, what would someone do, a real person do, if they got these abilities as like a teenager and just went off on their own? Okay, rob banks, start sleeping with every beautiful woman that they met around the world, and then leave with no strings attached. Basically live the most selfish life possible without overtly hurting anyone. It makes perfect sense. And once again, going back to the world building, I love the way David's apartment is designed. I thought about this while watching the movie, the fact that his apartment has secret rooms that only he can teleport into, and the fact that all of his walls are covered in pictures, that way he can just pick one to teleport to the location. It's very clever. And you see similar setups in Griffin's lair, where it's a very isolated space, and he's tailored it just to his comforts as a loner. Just another thing that visually communicates not only the world, but also these characters and the way they exist. And something else I also love about David's character, and this relates back to the teleportation ability, is that when he's initially assaulted by Samuel Jackson's character Roland in his apartment, he's trying to get away. You see that he grabs one of his pictures to see if he can jump to a location far away from him. But because there's too much electricity going through his brain, he can't focus. So he manages to get into his money room, and he gathers as much cash as he can, and then he just runs away without thinking. And the first place he ends up is his childhood bedroom. He ends up home, because home is where the heart is. But, putting that aside, he goes to a place he'd feel comfortable and safe, because that's what anyone would do in a panic situation. Without thinking, it's like, okay, I have to go home. And this is when he tries to, pick up his life where he left off. Since he has this guy chasing him now, he figures, okay, I'm far away from this guy, I'll just go home, lay low, and, reconnect with a beautiful girl in the process. It speaks to something that's quintessential about the human experience. The fact that when we're panicked, when we're afraid, our first instinct is to go home. And I think that element of the story is really interesting. And it also shows how his powers are not only active, how, he has to think about them, they're also reactive. And that's also established at the beginning of the film, because when we see him drowning as a teenager, the first time we see him use the ability, he's dying, so he panics and he teleports to a library, a quiet, safe place. It's something really interesting that I think reflects on both the character and the world-building mechanic of the teleportation. It's amazing. And Hayden Christensen is absolutely amazing in this movie. Like, his character is very charismatic, and he plays that very well, but he's also, very detached from everything, and you can feel that, which makes it all the more interesting when the character of David sort of reunites with, his childhood love, Millie, played by Rachel Bilson. And Millie's a very interesting character who is played very well by Bilson. She's sort of like this small-town girl next door type who had all these big dreams about where she wanted to go, how she wanted to spend her life. And then this boy comes back, this boy that she was interested in when she was very young, and he comes back under mysterious circumstances, and he just says, hey, why don't you come to Rome with me? Why don't you leave everything behind and come with me to Italy? And she just goes. And at first, it would seem like her character is lacking agency because she's just going along with everything. But you could also see in the film that she kind of has her guards up the entire time she's with David. Like, she wants to trust him, but she's not 100% there with him. And there's even a scene in the film when they first arrive in Rome, and she says to David, hey, don't lie to me. Like, she's setting up a specific expectation for David to fulfill, because she wants to be there with them. She wants to be swept up by the magic and the excitement of just going away with someone. But this is also someone that she hasn't seen in almost a decade. And despite the fact that they have history, and despite the fact that she has feelings for him, she's still like, okay, I'm not 100% with you, but I'm with you. And this is reinforced towards the end of the film, when David finally reveals to her that he has powers. First, he sneaks into her apartment, and then she's all like, hey, you abandoned me in another country. Get the fuck out of my apartment. And then he immediately, instead of telling her that he has powers, he just shows her. And like any rational person, she freaks out and tries to run away. And when the Paladins come to get David and Griffin, Millie's character cuts David down. One, probably because she still has lingering feelings for him, but two, and she says this verbally to him, if I cut you down, will you take me home and leave me alone? Because even though she may still care for him, she's upset that her entire life has basically just been uprooted and just says, leave me alone. Her character has an appropriate level of agency based on the way that she's been set up, and Rachel Bilson plays it perfectly. And I should also add that she and Hayden Christensen have stellar chemistry in this film. Like, I know that this is kind of heresy to say as a Star Wars fan, but Hayden Christensen has better chemistry with Rachel Bilson than he does with Natalie Portman. It's just true. And, to be fair, the way I interpret the story of the prequels, I don't think Anakin and Padme are supposed to be depicted as having a healthy relationship. In fact, they overtly don't. Like, I interpret those movies as the formation of a toxic codependency. But the simple fact of the matter is that most people feel like the two actors don't have romantic chemistry. And I agree with that. I don't think that they're supposed to, but, it's true that they don't. However, Rachel Bilson and Hayden Christensen do have romantic chemistry, and I thought about that while watching the movie and after I finished it. And then, shortly before I sat down to record this review, I looked it up and discovered, Hayden Christensen and Rachel Bilson actually started dating on the set of this film, and they even had a child 7 years later. So, yeah, the happily ever after at the end of the film, it's technically realistic. I don't know what else to say about it. I guess I'll bring up the fact that Hayden Christensen still has moments where he has, like, the creepy Anakin eyes, and I'm like, there's my guy. But, still, the chemistry's there. Also, a smaller point I wanted to bring up, completely unrelated, I just really like this. The younger David in this movie is played by an actor named Max Theriot, who does a really good job in this movie. And he also looks exactly like a young Hayden Christensen. Like, it's weird. Like, I'll put a picture right here of Max Theriot in this movie compared to, like, the younger Hayden Christensen, so you can see he looks a lot like a young Hayden Christensen. But Max Theriot also kind of looks like an older version of Jake Lloyd, who played the young Anakin in The Phantom Menace. So it's kind of funny that you could sort of bridge the gap between Hayden Christensen and Jake Lloyd with Max Theriot in the middle. It's sort of like how, there's 3 actors that play clones in the prequels. There's Daniel Logan, who I've met. There's Tamara Morrison, who plays the older clones, and also Jango Fett. And then there's Bodhi Taylor, who plays, like, the 20-something-year-old clones. So you have a bridge there of Daniel Logan, Bodhi Taylor, Tamara Morrison. Hey, I just like that. I think it's interesting. But, that's all the character stuff and how the actors play the roles. The last positive I want to bring up about this film, before I move on to the issues with it, is just how impressed I was with how the film was assembled. Not only how it was edited, but how it was shot. So I don't know exactly how many of the monuments and locations you see in this film are real as opposed to sets, but I do know that they went to several different countries and cities to actually film this film. Like, they actually went to Tokyo to film. And they actually went to Italy to film. In fact, Jumper was the first film in decades to actually shoot at the Rio Coliseum. When you see David and Millie go to the Coliseum in the movie, they're actually inside the actual Coliseum. The only time it's not the Coliseum is when David and Griffin are having the fight with the 2 Paladins. That's a set. But everything else, the establishing shots, the basement that Millie and David go under, the entryway, that's all the actual Coliseum. And that's astonishing. I tried finding out if they actually went to Egypt to film on the Sphinx, or if they actually went to Big Ben. Maybe I didn't research hard enough, but I don't know if they actually filmed there. But they did film in a lot of different locations in this movie. Also, side note, I've actually been to the Coliseum, and it is truly a majestic place. I would recommend going there if you can. But anyway, the thing that really impressed me about all the location shooting is that this is a movie about characters teleporting from place to place. And the simple fact of the matter is that even though in the movie it's being depicted as them moving in real time, in real life that simply cannot be the case. There's travel time between place to place, and you have to not only redress the actors when you go to each location to make sure that they maintain continuity with wherever they are, but you also have to make sure that they stay in roughly the same physical position that they were in if you're showing them immediately teleport from place to place. Like, that's just a ridiculously complex thing that you'd have to plan in advance. And I'm not sure how many of you know this, but most films are not shot linearly. They're not shot in sequence, according to the script. Most films are shot non-linearly according to location. Like, let's say I make a movie that starts in LA, and then halfway through the movie I go to New York, and then I end back in LA. I'd have to plan to shoot all of the beginning and ending scenes in LA, and then I'd have to shoot all the New York scenes separately, traveling there once. Because realistically speaking, it wouldn't make sense economically or scheduling-wise to simply shoot in LA and then jump to New York and then jump back to LA. That just wouldn't make sense. If I'm already in one location where I'm shooting a scene for later in the film, I'm going to shoot it all while I'm there. That's how most film productions are set up. And with how much traveling they did for Jumper, they would have had to 100% do that for this movie. And the fact that they would have had to film all those scenes separately of the characters teleporting, and then stitch them together to maintain the film's continuity, that's astonishing. Like, I was sitting there watching it, thinking about it, and I thought to myself, how did they do that? How did they do that? How did they do that? Like, there's one scene in particular that really made me think. It's when David finds his father dead on the floor, and he just has sort of this emotional meltdown. And you see him teleport his father's body to the hospital to see if he can save his father's life. And this scene illustrates a couple things. One, the fact that when jumpers get more emotional, they physically damage the spaces around them. But also, going back to the point of continuity, you see David move from one location to another, and he's maintaining almost exactly the same position holding over his father, even though they would have had to film those scenes in separate locations. And if I'm thinking about it, they probably just used a camera zoom-in technique and zoom-out technique to change locations like that, but regardless, it's still astonishing to look at. And I really just can't get over how impressive that is, and how that really attests to the talent of the people involved in this film. Of course, with that being said, at this point I should talk about the negatives regarding this film. So, Jumper had 3 writers and 1 director. The first writer was Stephen S. Goyer, who wrote Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance, which is unironically one of my favorite action films, the Blade trilogy, and he was also one of the writers on the Dark Knight trilogy. The second writer was Jim Ulhs, who wrote Fight Club, and the third writer, as well as being a producer on this film, was Simon Kinberg, who wrote X-Men Days of Future Past. Meanwhile, as mentioned, the director on this film was Doug Liman, who directed Mr. and Mrs. Smith, The Bourne Identity, Edge of Tomorrow, and Go, which is one of the greatest anthology films I've ever seen. Like, I'd put it up there with Chungking Express. It's really good. Now, to be fair, all 4 of these men have their fair share of duds, with the exception of Jim Ulhs, who really only has Jumper and Fight Club on his record. Of course, his lack of f***ups could probably be compensated for by Simon Kinberg's many cinematic flops. But putting that aside, you cannot deny the talent of the people involved making this film, which really makes it even more interesting how this film kind of fails. Like, if you're sitting there watching this movie, and to be fair, most people I talk to about this movie like it, but you could feel, at least I could, that something wasn't quite right the first time I watched it. And I had an idea of what was wrong with this film, but going into my third watch through of this film in order to make this review, it really stuck out to me what the problem with this movie is. You see, Jumper, as a film, falls into this category that I like to refer to as franchise bait. Basically, the movie was made during this time when Hollywood was still tackling some original ideas that sounded interesting. You know, concepts that had sort of a sci-fi or comic book-esque element, and instead of just making one solid film and then continuing the franchise after some success, the producers and studios end up leaving behind a bunch of dangling threads to set up future movies that end up never happening. There are a couple films that have this exact problem that came out around the same time as Jumper, like the movie Push, starring Chris Evans, or the movie Wanted, starring James McAvoy. These are films with interesting concepts, really solid world building, and typically have really solid setup in the first 2 acts. But by the time you get to Act 3, everything seems to fall apart as the films rush to a quote-unquote epic conclusion, which will be continued in a sequel that never happens. This is very overtly the problem with Jumper. And going back for a second to the idea that these films are vaguely comic book-esque, Doug Liman admits in the film's commentary that Jumper is basically this creative team's attempt to make a somewhat grounded superhero movie. This idea probably stems from the fact that both David S. Goyer and Simon Kinberg have worked on several different comic book films, and this would also likely explain why the rules regarding a jumper's abilities are vaguely similar to the X-Men character of Nightcrawler. I mean, for God's sake, they even reference Marvel Comics in this film. It's right before David and Griffin go on their drive in Tokyo. David uses the analogy of Marvel Team-Up comics to try to convince Griffin to team up with him in order to save Millie from the Paladins. Marvel Team-Up being the Marvel version of DC's Brave and the Bold, where you basically pair up two popular superheroes for a limited run. But yeah, unfortunately this film is franchise bait through and through. And this attempt at establishing a franchise just really drags the film down. You see, Jumper as a film has a pretty quick pace, and this is acknowledged by the creators. I think Doug Liman said that the reason they edited the film in the specific way that they did is because the main character can teleport from place to place, so he skips all the boring parts like standing in line. So when editing the film, they basically edit every scene to get right to the point. And the fact that information delivery in this film is still very efficient despite that editing choice is something that should be commended, but despite the movie being pretty quick, you can still latch onto elements of it as you go. But by the time you get to the last third of the film, everything feels like it's in such a rush to wrap up. Like, the movie already moved at a relatively quick pace, but it just really ramps it into high gear, and it feels like you break your neck by the end of the film, being like, what's going on, what's happening here? It's not that anything that's happening in the film is particularly complicated, it's just that the film is just throwing so much at you at once. It's like, okay, we're gonna have the final confrontation between the Paladins and the Jumpers, and then we're gonna have the personal fight between Roland and Griffin, and then Roland is going to take Millie, and then Griffin and David are going to have, like, their epic fight, and then David's going to come back and he's going to get captured by Roland, and you get the point. You get the idea. And then the whole film wraps up with David confronting his mother, and that's obviously meant to set up a sting for a future film, as I mentioned earlier. And by the end of it, you're just thinking to yourself, man, this movie had a good thing going, and it just really dropped the ball at the end. Because they just set up way too much for the future. They even casted a half-sister character for David, and they casted Kristen Stewart, who was, you know, an up-and-coming actress in 2008. Like, Kristen Stewart had already been in a couple hits at that point, like she was in the movie Panic Room, directed by David Fincher. So to have her in this awkward cameo at the end, setting up a potential future character and a relationship between two siblings, it's just weird. It's like, oh, you're a famous person, why are you coming at the end of the movie? And apparently what had happened was that Doug Liman promised Kristen Stewart and Diane Lane bigger parts in future movies if they came in and did this. It's very similar to how Denis Villeneuve promised both Zendaya and Florence Pugh bigger parts in Dune sequels if they agreed to do Dune's Part 1 and Part 2 respectively. The only difference here is that that gamble did not pay off for Jumper, which is unfortunate. You know, like I said, obviously this film did make the mistake of trying to set up a franchise too early, trying to sequelize too early. But despite the rushed ending, I still really like this movie. It's just unfortunate that overall it just comes out to slightly above average because of the ending. You know, it's just like that idea of how a good ending can save a bad movie. The opposite here is true. A bad ending can ruin a pretty good movie. The ending didn't bring Jumper all the way down to terrible, but unfortunately, this film does fall short of being great because of that. Still, putting that all aside, I do really enjoy Jumper. And I think genuinely a lot of thought went into the premise and concept behind this film, and it's executed quite well. I think that this is a movie worth seeing. I think Hayden Christensen is a criminally underrated actor, and he's really good in this movie. And you know, who knows? We're getting legacy sequels for everything nowadays, and Hayden Christensen is more popular than he's ever been, coming back to the character of Anakin in both the Obi-Wan Kenobi show and Ahsoka. So why not do a legacy sequel to Jumper? Like, why not? I mean, despite the fact that Jumper got negative reviews for its ending, it still made a lot of money. It had like an $85 million budget and it made like $225 million. It was successful enough to warrant a sequel, they just never made one, so do it. I'd like to see another Jumper. Jumper 2, Roland Strikes Back. I don't know, working title. I mean, like I said, Jumper was based on a book and there's a few more books in that series, so I don't know. Anyway, that was my review of the movie Jumper. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please feel free to subscribe if you're feeling generous. You can also follow me on Instagram or Letterboxd if you want to hear more of my film takes. And I will see you later. Okay, so, funny thing. The lightsaber that I was playing with during the review was this Force FX Mace Windu lightsaber. This is actually one of the first lightsaber replicas that they made after Revenge of the Sith. Actually, I think it was Attack of the Clones, maybe. But I got this lightsaber, I think, as a birthday present for my 14th or 15th birthday. Maybe it was my 16th. But I've had it for over a decade. And, I never changed the batteries in it. So I was freaking out because a couple nights ago, I checked because I was like, oh, I can use the lightsaber for the review. And I opened it up. The battery pack was completely corroded. I freaked out. Because I remembered, oh my god, you're not supposed to leave batteries in a thing years at a time. The acid starts to leak out, it interacts with the metal in a way, and it expands. It's bad. It's bad. I was freaking out. I had no idea if I had ruined the saber or not. But what I did is that I took the battery pack out. I managed to pry out all of the leaked batteries. And what I did is that I cleaned the battery pack with some Q-tips, that you're not supposed to stick in your ears. I dipped each Q-tip in isopropyl alcohol and then cleaned out all the remaining battery acid from the corrosion. I stuck new batteries in, I stuck it back in, and so yeah, if you've had that corrosion issue, just pull out the battery pack, clean it with Q-tips, hopefully it works. Hopefully it isn't too rusted for you to do that. I've also heard that white vinegar works as well, but yeah. Anyway, that's not the only thing I want to do in this end tag. Since this is somewhat of a Star Wars video, I figured I'd make this video another entry in my raffle. For those of you who don't know, every few videos I include a new piece of merchandise into a raffle pot that slowly grows over time, and when I reach my first 500 subscribers, I'll randomly select a winner to give away that pot to. So, since I talked a lot about Star Wars and Hayden Christensen in this review, I figured what better item to add than this Darth Vader patch. Like, this is a pretty wicked design. It's very much in, like, the Darth Vader aesthetic that was set up after Revenge of the Sith. Like, I would keep it to put it on my own jacket, but I sort of have, like, this World War II bomber style going on this jacket. I have a Dexter Jetster here, blast them all, God will sort them out, the Force will sort them out. I have a Cara Dune's Rosie the Riveter. I have all this. I have a pin up here. Like, I have a sort of World War II/1950 style bomber thing going on with this jacket. So, I'll just give this Vader patch to whoever wins my raffle. If you would like to be entered, all you have to do is comment under this video and subscribe to my channel. Like I said, I will randomly select a winner when I reach my first 500 subscribers. So, may the Force be with you, always.